Today we're going to talk about gas detection, and specifically gas detection when it's involved in a safety instrumented system. So I'm Chris O'Brien, and I'm a partner with Exida, and I help our customers, both equipment manufacturers and process owners, implement the functional safety standards. I've got over 25 years experience, and hopefully can provide a little insight into this topic today. All right, so today we're going to talk about requirements for SIF design when utilizing gas detection equipment, typical gas detection SIFs, that is what things may be SIFs and what things may not be SIFs. We'll take a look at market and regulatory compliance issues when using gas detection systems, and then talk about product certification strategies or approaches different organizations take to show that their equipment is suitable for use in these high availability, high reliability systems. So let's start with reviewing what the definition of a safety instrumented function is. So specifically, if we go down to the core of it, a safety instrumented function, or SIF, is defined as a single set of actions and the corresponding equipment necessary to identify a single hazard and act to bring the system to a safe state. So it encompasses all the equipment and all the actions that have to occur to detect a dangerous condition, decide what to do about a dangerous condition, and then move to mitigate that condition, either mitigate or prevent that condition from continuing to an unwanted event. So often we'll also talk about safety instrumented systems, and the way to think about it is a safety instrumented system contains one or more SIFs, and specific risk reduction targets or SIL levels are defined for the safety instrumented functions themselves. So in the standards, there's a process called a functional safety life cycle, and it looks to identify, design, maintain systems and processes to mitigate these risks and hazards we're talking about. So the first step is hazard identification, and it's basically getting a good understanding of what can go wrong. Techniques used there, the general category is called process hazard analysis, and a very common technique in the chemical and refining industry would be the HAZOP technique. Once the potential hazards are identified, we need to understand how bad could it be. And so we need to do a risk analysis that will drive a SIL selection. Often the technique there could be a layer of protection analysis, or LOPA, or it could be done through some other means such as risk graph or hazard matrix. We'll call it in general the step 2 is done, you need to determine and document. So in step 2, we've determined how much risk reduction we need. So now we need to document exactly what must happen. Now this is really a critical thing, because to say, oh, I need to detect, let's say we're concerned about the risk of nitrogen asphyxiation, need to detect nitrogen near reactor 103. Well, you want to be specific enough and define the areas and define exactly the operational parameters, so when the safety function is designed, you can then go and verify that it's achieving those levels of risk reduction and those performance requirements. So you want to be pretty specific in the safety requirements spec, as far as even concentrations, specific areas where it's of a concern, and obviously the gas that you're looking for. SIL verification then takes a look at how reliable is the actual system. So that goes to the question of, sorry, just checking to make sure everything was working fine. Doing a calculation to say how reliable that equipment is. And one thing that often comes in with a gas system is the probability of being able to sense the gas. So there would be the reliability, the safety reliability of the gas sensor, of the logic solver, of the valving or fanning or alarm system or personnel response. But there also has to be considered is how likely is it that that sensor or array of sensors is going to be able to pick up the gas that's the hazard we're looking for. And finally, let's say we've targeted, developed, and designed an effective SIF. We need to maintain that through its entire life. And that's how to keep it safe and 10 years down the road ensuring that it's providing the same reliability and protection it did day one. So if you identify a SIF and you've designed it, there's three things you need to show compliance. You need to show the SIL capability, you need to address the probability of failure on demand, and you need to address architectural constraints. And only when all three of those things have been met are you in compliance. So we think about what we're trying to do. So SIL capability, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but there's two main areas we're looking at preventing failures from. Systematic failures or systematic faults and random failures. So SIL capability has to do with the robustness of the OEM, the gas detector themselves, their development, manufacturing, and management of change process. So SIL capability is a strength against systematic failures. Probability of failure on demand is driven and calculated from the failure rates, and it's a strength against random failures. And architectural constraints are also a strength against random failures, but I talk about them as like a strength against undetected failures, because the higher percentage of your failures that are undetected, the more redundancy you put in place. So they are driven by random failure rates, but they're kind of heavily influenced by, do you know about the failures or don't you? Now, a SIF is a specific type of independent protection layer. And an important thing to remember as you're looking and designing these things are that there's four tests a potential function has to pass to be considered an independent protection layer. First, it must be specific. That means that it's designed and capable of preventing the consequence of the potentially hazardous event. Second, it must be independent. It must be completely independent from all other protection layers or initiating events. Third, it must be dependable. So it must be capable of acting dependently to prevent the consequence from occurring. So that addresses both the systematic and the random faults. And fourth, it must be auditable. So you have to be able to test it and maintain it to ensure you've got that safety integrity over the mission time of the system. The reason I want to bring that up is because gas detection can provide some unique challenges different than, say, pressure in a vessel. The thing that I mentioned before is the likelihood that the gas sensors can pick up the hazard. So if you're in a large environment, outdoor environment, even a large indoor environment, you need to consider not only the safety reliability of the equipment, but the probability of sensors of the gas sensors being able to detect the gas. So if you're outdoor, you've got varying weather conditions that are going to affect how gas disperses, and that really does impact whether you would consider it a SIF or not. So often, if you're looking at a plant-wide gas detection system, it's often not considered a classic SIF. It is because when you start trying to put a probability of finding or sensing a leak, it's hard to put a number on that without a detailed computational fluid dynamic analysis. And even if you do, then you say, wow, we might only see it half the time or less. But even if it's not a SIF, it's often considered safety critical. It can be a layer of protection, so it might not prevent the leak, or you still might have a fairly large leak by the time you're sure you'll detect it. But you can alarm and train your folks and indicate people need to evacuate. Often treated as part of the fire and gas system with the same life cycle requirements as a SIF. So when people are picking the equipment for it, or coming up with the testing, or putting in place management of change, they're going to put the same rigor on these systems as they do for a classic SIF. But you're probably going to stop short of doing a probability of failure on demand calculations just because of the wide variability of ability to sense. Typical places where things are going to be a SIF, a classic SIF: analyzer building, shelter-in-place facilities, gas turbine compartments, or anything with confined areas with combustible gases, boiler houses, inerted reactors. So these are places where you might use, like the analyzer building, it's going to look in there before somebody goes inside, or if somebody's inside, it's going to alarm and have them leave. A shelter-in-place facility, it's going to be looking for those toxic gases and stopping the ventilation if it senses them in the ventilation system. Gas turbine compartment, it's looking for leaks, and if there's a leak, it's going to trip the turbine. Boiler house is again looking for a leak and enunciating and tripping the system if necessary. Inerted reactors is often a place you'll see things looking for N2 asphyxiation, nitrogen asphyxiation, so that's important, inside a building where you're going to have lots of people walking around and doing stuff. So there are cases which the large plant-wide stuff that certainly may not be a classic SIF, but there are many cases where you are going to have a classic SIF where people are calculating PFD average and trying to show a specific reliability. Now, these loops and requirements have been around for quite a while. They're not new, but what's changing are market requirements and regulatory requirements. So market requirements, leading research organizations are identifying SIL rating equipment as a fast-growing market segment, advising OEMs to get certified because, and I think about 15% of all gas detection loops right now are SIL rated loops, meaning they're going into SIFs. So gas is a fair amount of the applications are already SIL related. End user customers are looking for third-party certification of equipment, driven primarily to the critical nature of the application. And even if it's not a SIF, by its nature, looking for these toxic gases or explosive atmospheres, obviously there's a lot of risk inherent in the processes that contain them. And then regulatory requirements. This is probably the largest overall driver or mover. So in many countries, compliance with functional safety standards is a regulation or required by law. If you look at European Union directives or major hazard facility laws such as in Australia, they're going to say if you've got these types of applications, you need, the major hazard facilities say you need to file 61508, well, AS 61508 or AS 61511. The EU directive, Savasive directive, points to IEC 61511 as a requirement for safety instrumented functions for those loops we've just been talking about. Even in countries that don't have these types of directives, such as the U.S., they're going to require a mature process safety management program. So, for example, OSHA doesn't require 61511, but they require a mature process and have stated, hey, compliance to ISA S84 or IEC 61511 demonstrates a mature process. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of recognition of the need for these types of holistic approaches to managing functional safety needs. So the overriding standard is IEC 61508, and derivative standard for the process industry is IEC 61511, or in the U.S. it's ISA S84, but they're the same standard. And those standards, IEC 61511, which is the functional safety standard for the process industry, that requires that equipment used in safety instrumented systems are chosen based on IEC 61508 assessment or justified based on prior use requirements. And we'll go through what those requirements are in a couple slides. But before we do that, I want to dig into a little bit about this concept of an overall holistic approach to functional safety and why there really is a difference between general equipment and equipment specifically designed for functional safety applications. So I mentioned the safety life cycle, and we had that one graphic earlier with the 5 different major phases. We can look at it a different way and think about it as kind of a bridge to safety. There's some major pillars like planning, protection against systematic failures, protection against random failures, and there's a whole bunch of supporting cables talking about safety management or risk assessments or SIL verification or SIS validation. And obviously, you need those major towers to support the bridge, but you also need each of those independent or individual support cables to have a strong bridge that's going to get that design all the way through concept, design, and operation and maintain it in a safe state. So whether you're an OEM building a piece of equipment or whether you're an end user designing a safety protection function, there are specific steps that need to be addressed and take place. One thing that the standard does is say, if you are not using a piece of equipment that's designed per the standards, the maximum risk reduction you can take is essentially 10. The wording is less than 10, but it shall be below 10. But essentially, you can claim some risk reduction. It acknowledges that there's a benefit to it, but it limits it at a fairly low level. So it limits it below a SIL 1 level. And there's a reason for that. The reason is, to do that, there's no analysis of faults required. There's no testing required. There's no restriction to access of either the gas detector or the PLC or the valving required. There's no specific change management required. There's nothing really different than a general loop required. And because of that, you can't claim, you don't have to put that overhead in there, but you also can't claim higher risk reduction. What can happen if you're using optimistic data or you're applying a greater risk reduction to a piece of general equipment based on an incomplete assessment, you're going to wind up undermining some of the key pinnings of this bridge to safety. Your safety instrumented system might be under-designed. You may not do sufficient testing. You may have systematic faults in that piece of equipment that you're not aware of and the OEM is not aware of. And one place that this really shows up is sometimes a manufacturer will use field return data to calculate a failure rate, which tends to be quite optimistic because while they know what they ship and they know what's returned, they don't know how those pieces of equipment were tested and how many of those failures were either first detected, and of the detected failures, what % were returned to the OEM. So you can wind up with very optimistic data where you can show non-redundant systems reaching high SIL 2 or more with no redundancy, no diagnostic. If you model that same system with reasonable data, you wind up with a risk reduction of about 40 times lower than the optimistic data would say. And I just can't point out enough that optimistic data or oversimplified justification of equipment when it comes to safety instrumented systems is unsafe, because by definition we're putting these loops on the most critical parts in the plant. So you really want to be rigorous about the approach. So let's talk about the paths or the approaches to product certification. So I wrote justification, but then I crossed that out because we want to move out of this mindset of justifying we can do something to actually being able to show we have the traceability and the rigor has been put into the analysis. So we're allowed to use a general piece of equipment and claim a risk reduction up to 10. It's only when we start wanting to claim a risk reduction of 100 or 1,000, these a lot of eggs in one basket scenarios I talk about, that this additional requirement and rigor needs to be put into place. So we want to be into a kind of a formal assessment mode. But for gas analyzers, there's 4 general kind of paths that we've seen. First is proven in use. Second is OEM self-certification. Third is there's a European standard EN 50271. And then finally, IEC 61508. Now let's remember back to the requirement of IEC 61511 only gives us 2 paths. The only paths that says are valid are a proven in use justification and an IEC 61508 assessment. So these 2 middle paths are kind of derivations that have been evolved, and one's even a standard, but it doesn't truly address what IEC 61511 says you need to do. So let's start with proven in use. So proven in use is a path, is a method that allows the users of a piece of equipment to use equipment, test equipment, collect the data, and make the argument themselves that they have shown the device is suitable for use in SIL applications. So to do that, they need a thorough statistical and traceable analysis of the installed equipment, and that equipment needs to be identical. So, and we'll get to some examples of how even a small software change can cause a problem in a few slides. But this means it's the exact same hardware and it's the exact same software, and enough have been installed and run and used and tested over a period of time to demonstrate the robustness of the product for SIL applications. So every application has to have statistical analysis. If it's got FPL, fixed programming language, then you've got to do a level 2 assessment where the embedded software functionality has to be analyzed and shown to be fit for use. And if it's a SIL 3 application, basically the standard says you've got to perform your own 61508 assessment. So it puts the responsibility on the user of the equipment, and analyzers and detectors are going to have software, so you're at least at a level 2, so you've got to do a statistical hardware analysis, and you've got to do a fit for use analysis for the software. So that's a lot of responsibility for the end user. It is a path that's available. It's more practical probably if you're using a device such as a valve or an actuator where there's no software, and it becomes very difficult once you get into software-based products. Another thing that is happening in the market is some OEMs are issuing self-certifications. And in 61508, there is a table that talks about the degree of independence and expertise you need to do an assessment. So essentially, the first thing is there has to be a level of competency in the body doing the assessment. So that would indicate that the OEM was essentially a global functional safety expert. They had somebody within their organization that had the functional safety expertise equal to a lead assessor in a third-party organization. That's a pretty high hurdle to cover. Second thing is there has to be a degree of independence. So if it's SIL 1, it has to be done by an independent person. If it's SIL 2, it has to be done by an independent department. And if it's SIL 3, it has to be done by an independent organization. So even if we just looked at SIL 2, you have to have an independent department from probably the design team, the engineering department, in ways of management and resources such as funding to do that. So if we combine the requirement to have that level of expertise, if it is in an OEM, it's probably going to be in the development team. So you're really not even going to be able to meet, if you could meet the first requirement, you'd have a hard time meeting the second requirement of being independent. Then if an OEM did do that, then they should provide a safety case, which is basically the documentation that would show how every requirement in the standard has been met. They should be able to provide an assessment report, a declaration of impartiality, and a safety manual. So those, if you're thinking of doing this as an OEM, or you're looking at buying a piece of equipment, then you might want to look at least for these documents in this third bullet. Equipment users tend to be leery of this approach, not that they don't trust OEMs, but they like a little bit of independence between the assessing body and the people making the equipment. And I personally know of a situation where an assessing organization went to, and it was a gas detector OEM, went to an OEM, did a gap analysis. Basically, the company had good procedures, but they weren't as robust as 61508 required, so they would have had to put some additional procedures in place and done some additional work. I don't think that the OEM liked that feedback, because about 3 to 6 months later, they issued a self-certification to SIL 3, no redundancy, which is really not even a credible approach. So it was, the market's a little leery of this, because often OEMs will do it without fully understanding what they're saying they can do, or frankly, as a shortcut. Third approach is there is a standard, there's EN 50271, and it essentially kind of implies that if you meet that standard, you meet SIL 1. But EN 50271 is not equivalent to 61508. It does provide a general framework of what a safety life cycle would be, but if you crack open 5271 and compare it to IEC 61508, what you'll immediately see is EN 50271 is really more guidance. It doesn't, and if you look at 61508, you'll see tables and specific requirements for what you need to do for code coverage, what you need to do for code review, what you need to do for a coding standard, what you need to do for many, many very specific things. And EN 50271 does talk about those concepts and says you should do this, but it doesn't really put the framework about what level of doing is acceptable. So it basically says in the standard, hey, if you do this, you're going to meet SIL 1. But if you compare the two, if you compare 61508 and EN 50271, they're not the same standard. So I think anybody using that should do a careful comparison between the standards and determine if the things covered for them in EN 50271 make it acceptable for their application. And then finally, and to go back to this, IEC 61511, which is the thing referenced by OSHA. They reference S84, which is the modified IEC 61511, or it's the standard pointed to by the Seveso directive, or it's the standard that the Australian gas authorities are going to look at before they allow you to put gas to your plant. IEC 61511 doesn't talk about EN 50271. It talks about assessments to 61508. And you would have to show the traceability from 50271 and how that met 61508 to satisfy that requirement. So it's a step in the right direction, but I would call it still light, not really 61508. Then finally we have IEC 61508, which has a detailed life cycle for the development of product and the management of product. It has an analysis phase, a realization phase, and an operation phase. It has specific requirements and measures of performance that have to be met. It defines a V model for software development. And so software or application-specific integrated circuits are areas that are very important. Not that the hardware is very important, but also is the software, because that's often somewhat overlooked, because where a good percentage of the systematic faults are going to be introduced are going to be the software development and design process or the implementation. So the requirements for the software process are very robust in IEC 61508. They're spelled out, specific steps, specific amounts of rigor that must be done. So that V model development process is very important. And if we take, like, for example, 61508 says you must do tool justification. So any, tools are classified as between, category T1, T2, T3, depending on the impact they can have on design. For any, for any tools used in product development, and that can be CAD tools, it can be compilers, it can be simulation tools, you've got to do a justification that that tool isn't going to introduce an error. And to point out why this matters, this is a real-life example about the impact of a tool. So this was a company had made quite a few SIL-rated products. They were using the same compiler. During the final audit for certification, a RAM test was implemented. Nothing happened. A bad bit was injected. Nothing happened. The diagnostics didn't see it. Well, in digging into what happened, why that didn't work, why this product that had previously worked and had these good diagnostic coverage didn't work, it was found that the software engineer had simply set the optimization level up one level. Optimizer concluded that the diagnostic code, for example, save a byte to a temporary location, set all bits, clear all bits, return the original value, could be eliminated. It did exactly that. Had a major, so one, it made the diagnostics not work because the code was gone, and it meant that this OEM had to go back through and redo a fair part of that project with the compiler with the proper setting and redo the validation testing. So here's something that I will guarantee you that a company that's doing a self-cert or a company that's looking at EN 50271, if they're not reading 61508 and understanding it and deploying it, they're not going to find the nuances and these critical things that thus functional safety standards say you must do. So it's really it's not a case of like technical one-upsmanship. It's a case of there are real faults and real problems that happen in equipment that if you're going to be using these in safety critical applications when you're claiming a lot of risk reduction for, the reason you have to follow these rigorous standards is there's all these things that can go wrong, and 61508 does a pretty, well, it doesn't do a perfect job, but does a pretty exhaustive job of identifying procedures and processes to minimize those systematic faults. If we look at a typical 61508 project, there's going to be kind of in the center, on the left side, we've got the analysis of the hardware. We have a software criticality analysis, communication protocol analysis to understand, document, and show how the device is working. Then on the right side, there's a lot of process-related things, which will deal with the engineering process, management of change, impact analysis. There are quite a few documents that an OEM needs to produce a functional safety management plan, a safety requirements spec, validation test plan, tool justification. We just looked at that as an example. What's the software process? Is there a coding standard? Are they following it? Software module test plan, integration plan, safety manual. So there's a lot of things that are in 61508 that are necessary to design these high availability, high reliability systems. Exodus helps customers in all different ways. Library of information, training classes, tools. We provide lifecycle services, I think as most people would know on this call, and assessments and certification. So we provide a lot of background and help for those things, both for OEMs and equipment manufacturers. So now we've got a few minutes left, and I think I'd like to open it up to questions. Oh, got some questions maybe. I don't know if people, probably everybody can see this. This is a very good, so this looks like health and safety executive said 60%. The effectiveness for detection is 60%. So could gas detection loops be a false sense of security? That's a very good point. So that's the, and we can take it from two extremes. So on one extreme, if we've got a turbine, a compartment around a gas turbine that's got gas piping in it, that's a relatively small volume. It's a pretty rectangular shape. We can put one or two sensors in there and get coverage of the area. Pretty light, and it's closed doors, it's closed in, so you're going to be able to sense if there's a leak. The other extreme is you've got stuff out in the plant with varying wind conditions. You may or may not be able to detect it. So what I've seen is, in the first case, those things being designed as SIFs and credit being taken for them. In the second case, where it might be a plant-wide monitoring, you may not even take a risk reduction as an IPL, but you certainly put it in place, because even if you only find it, say, 60% of the time, you're going to want to know about a major leak. Or you may only see it after it becomes a major leak, but you can enunciate on it and start some remediation and evacuation. So the second question is, how can a SIL-rated gas detection system be justified with PFD counts? So I think that the key things there is it likely to see the gas? So if you've got good coverage and you think you're going to be able to detect it, and that all goes to, I think, the area and the volume you're looking at, then you could do it. And you can take credit for operator response with an alarm. So you can do it, and you can even, typically that would be your limit at 10. But if, for example, you were going to trip a turbine on a gas leak, or you're going to trip a boiler if there's a gas leak in a boiler house, then you could do that, and that could give you higher reliability. Or the other thing that often happens is, let's say you have an analyzer house, you may lock the door and not let anybody in if you detect gas, or you would, enunciate it with a horn or a light. And the point's very true that it doesn't address, people might say, well, I want SIL 2 at least for my gas detection and enunciation phase. I'm not going to worry about, and that's just a for example. I realize my person has to make the right decision then, but I want this level of reliability for this part of my function. And then another question about ISA TR 84.00.7. So that is a technical report addressing the a gas detection that gives guidance on what to do, and I know that that's under review and development again. So I would say that all of those kind of like the CCS books, CCPS books, health and safety studies, technical reports are very good to read to be informed. Now, as far as like a regulation, the technical report, that ISO technical report, is a informative report, which is very useful and provides a lot of insight, but it's not a normative report. It's not a requirement. So the normative part would be 61511 or 61508, but the technical reports are very useful things to try to get an understanding. And I think a couple of these questions have brought out that issue of effectiveness, and you're going to want to have a high confidence that you're going to detect the gas to move it to the SIF zone. But even if you don't, you will have it probably as a safety critical thing, and in some cases you may claim it as an IPL. But that is going to be very site specific and application specific, and there's not an answer. There's not a single answer because it is so driven by the application. So this, see if we've got any other questions? Okay, let's give it a couple minutes and see if we have any other questions. So here's kind of a question / comment. Guess, can max be still one if it involves operator response? So typically, 61511 says you need to evaluate the reliability of the operator, and without doing a human reliability analysis, it's normally limited to a factor of 10, which would be still 1. However, if there is more time, more training, you could claim higher reliability, but that then goes into a second analysis of how reliable would you relate the operator to be, given the training and the timing and the situations. And I've seen cases where people have claimed higher, but they've done that human reliability analysis. They had specific training in place that they did periodically. So without doing that, I think, Neville, you're right that the maximum would be you would use that operator limit of 1 in 10. Okay, we'll post this on our website, and we'll send a link to everybody. And we can wait a few more minutes, see if there's any questions. All right, well, thanks everybody for joining, and again, please just contact myself or Exeter if you have questions, and we'll be sending an email with the link to the presentation.